Hello, my name is Thomas, and if you're watching this video, you probably know that I have a podcast called British Culture Albion Never Dies, which comes out every 2 weeks and answers the question, what is Britishness? From time to time, I get people asking me a question, which is, Thomas, can you teach me to be as cool as you? And the answer is, of course, no. You can likely only be cooler. But I also get the question, how do you put your podcast together? So I thought I'd answer that question in this podcast, this video podcast. The first thing is, of course, to be pretty relaxed about your mistakes. The other thing is to prepare. That's a big part of what I do when I'm putting together my podcast, and I've created over 200 episodes over the last few years. Like I said, it comes out every 2 weeks, as long as I can make it, because obviously I have a day job like most normal people. My job, I teach academic English at universities. I've taught at the University of Leeds, the University of Bradford, and I've worked overseas a great deal as well, in China, Saudi Arabia, Oman. If you've listened to the podcast, you've probably heard this a few times, but worth saying where I come from, in terms of where I'm coming from when I attack this topic, Britishness. It comes from a very international perspective, because often I meet people who might never have met a British person before, but they've still got a very fixed idea about the UK, and I'm fascinated to find out where that idea comes from. And that's my first point of inspiration for any of the podcast episodes I'm doing. So it often touches on culture, could touch on politics, but it comes from conversations for the most part. Conversations I've had over many years, and conversations I'm still having now. So one of the most essential pieces of equipment I have is my mobile phone, because of course through Instagram, through Gmail. On Instagram I'm at Fleming Never Dies, a very James Bond focused account, but there I get messages from people telling me what they think about British culture. It could be Brits in the UK, Brits overseas, non-Brits who are fascinated by British culture. Those conversations are absolutely invaluable, and from time to time they'll say, hey, why don't you do a podcast on this? And they'll suggest a topic, and I really enjoy those suggestions. A lot of my podcast episodes are listener requests, and I really value that enormously. It might just come to me, I might get a topic as I'm going jogging or shopping or something else. But first of all, that's where the inspiration comes from. That's where it all starts. The next thing I'll do, as you can see, I've got on my laptop a PowerPoint open. So I'll have a PowerPoint mainly because when I'm recording, I really don't want to be struggling for names, dates, but also because when I'm teaching, most teachers these days have a PowerPoint, but obviously it doesn't have all the information. It's not a script, it's just a few key dates, a few ideas. Making the PowerPoint is actually a big part of this because it's how I think things through. I'm keeping notes on my phone, I'm thinking it through, but I really want to get, first of all, a big structure. So, I know it's going to be a half-hour talk. Try and divide it down into, maybe 1-minute segments, probably a bit more. So I'll have a slide for every minute and a half, maybe a slide for every 2 minutes. It'll have key data and key information, but ordering it is actually quite important. So yeah, on here I've got an old PowerPoint open, so it's already finished, and it might have quotes from books. It might have kind of reflections I have upon that, again, just in case any ideas are dropping out of my head as I'm recording, because it tends to be all in one take. But I've always got a few episodes on the go, so I might have a few, it's blank except for the headlines. So, I do the headlines first, and then I fill in. That structure is really important, so it has kind of a clean, logical through, right? So the listener doesn't get too lost as they're going through the podcast. So that's something I'll have. And how long does it take me to do? Like I say, the podcast comes out every 2 weeks, but it doesn't necessarily mean it takes 2 weeks to do the PowerPoint. In rare cases, it could be an afternoon's work. I might be belting through it on a Saturday afternoon. News ones comes to mind if I'm talking about local news stories, because there I'm browsing the articles on a really good day, full of news that's worth talking about, and I'll talk about it. But the longest one I've had is probably the one on American independence, the British perspective, because I spent time in America, spent time here, I've talked to quite a large number of kind of enthusiasts. It's a little bit outside my usual interests, and I wanted to build a certain element of trust that there's not going to be one nation bashing the other. So that one I actually sat on for a few years as I worked through the structure. So that's probably the longest one. And film reviews I tend not to do in the moment. So I tend to watch the film a few times, maybe look into different things I found interesting. So I think No Time to Die, it's a big Bond film. I've got a Bond Instagram, but I actually spent, I think, a year thinking about it until eventually I did my review. So I don't like to be breaking news. I like to reflect upon things. After all, I'm talking about, for example, medieval history from time to time. Got a pretty good book collection. Worked in publishing briefly. This is one of my favourite medieval history books. It's A Great and Terrible King, Edward I, and I just think that's a really interesting story. So often if I'm referring to medieval history, I might tend to go back to this one. I'm talking about Britain and the world. So naturally I might talk about the British Empire, so Lawrence James, The Rise and Fall of the British Empire. I've got these books kind of scattered around and on bookshelves, so I'm often drawing upon these as well, and that's something that might have a series of bookmarks. I'm reading through them as I'm giving my podcast, or I might have typed something up just so that I can kind of think it through whilst I'm typing it up and add in a few of my own reflections as we go along. So it's not just, I don't like to do repackaged content, so I like to have my own thoughts and ideas added in. It's a bit of extra value, I guess. But yeah, I'll use this PowerPoint not so much as a script, but just for structuring and as a bit of a guide and a bit of a reminder for names, dates, places. As for recording, well, naturally I'll normally have some blankets, some cushions underneath here, so it will try and baffle the sound as much as possible. When I first started, there was a lot of editing. I was a bit thrown off by having a microphone. Normally when I'm teaching a class, I teach to adults. It's dialogic. You're going back and forth, you're asking questions, and people aren't always forthcoming. It's a one-sided talk to a certain extent, but you do have somebody there. So not having somebody there was a bit tricky at first, and I was very, very sensitive on sound editing. I've done this kind of thing for companies, which does help, but doing it by yourself, for yourself, is a different matter when you're a one-man band. So I was doing a lot of editing at first. These days, I'm a little bit more relaxed. I notice sometimes the podcast, if I listen back, is a bit more naturalistic, and that's partly me being at home, also me being a bit more relaxed with my occasional flubs, mistakes, word pronunciations, which does occasionally get picked up in the comments, and I totally own, sometimes I'll say something wrong, I'll flub. So I've tended to keep those in, as it's a bit more natural. It's how I teach a class, how I deliver a lecture. So it's how I deliver these. It's a pretty honest take on my teaching. And the most interesting thing, I record it, half an hour, I listen back, make a few edits. I don't keep all the coughs and sneezes, if there are any. Cut those out. It's not nice to listen to. So I cut out those egregious examples. The most interesting thing for me is once I've set it to release, it releases, and often the first time I've had a chance to look at it, somebody's already listened and already left a comment. And for me, that comment section is really, really interesting. Sometimes I do learn about the perfect book I should have read after the episodes come out, but that's really, really important for me because British culture is a topic I'm going to keep carrying on talking about. And I'll probably come back to some of these topics. I don't talk about them in isolation, and it's not like I've talked about it once so I can never talk about it again. Some things like James Bond, that will come up just because of how people find me. So here I've got For My Eyes Only by John Glenn. I'm still proud to have had John Glenn on the podcast. He's the director of 5 James Bond films. I have his book signed. To Steve, regards John Glenn. So thank you, Steve, for selling your copy so I could have a signed copy of John Glenn's book. So that's something, for example, I might draw on along with various other books I have. But yeah, I'll always discover a new one, often through the comment section. And from time to time I get, hey, you talked about this, why didn't you talk about this one thing? In a lot of cases it might be because something has been talked about to death and I want to cover it from a new angle. Sometimes it's just because if I talk about it a little to give it justice, I need to talk about it far more and I'm saving it from a later. But sometimes it's just because genuinely I didn't have the idea to talk about it, and I see that comment and I talk about it later on in another episode. So that's how I do my podcast, from the initial idea to the research and structuring. Recording it, relatively straightforward. Half an hour, 40 minutes with a mic. Editing, more and more straightforward these days. It rolls out on iTunes, Spotify, and of course here on YouTube audio only. And then back to idea again as I read through the comment section. So that's how I do my podcast. That's the answer to the question. Carry on being far cooler than me, and do leave comments if you enjoyed this, or if you're saying, hey, you didn't answer this, because I'll get back to it in many cases. Thanks for watching. See you later.